This is Cast of Wonders, the fiction podcast for young adults featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome. Today we present Jessie Bishop Powell's story, Loma'ai. Jessie has been writing since age 10. Her favourite authors include Diana Wynne Jones, Tamora Pierce and Neil Gaiman. She holds a master's degree in English from the University of Kentucky, but considers it irrelevant to good writing. She blogs at jesterqueen.com. Her next young adult project is a book featuring a plucky thief named Flory. Snatches of that story can be found on her blog. I will warn that her blog contains adult language at times. Your narrator today is the inimitable Tina Connolly. Tina lives with her family in Portland, Oregon. Her stories have appeared in Strange Horizons, Lightspeed, and Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and her Nebula-nominated novel, Ironskin, is now out from Tor Books, with the sequel Copperhead coming in October 2013. She narrates for Podcastle and Beneath Ceaseless Skies. She runs the Parsec-winning flash fiction podcast Toasted Cake, and her website is tinaconnolly.com. Check the show notes for details. Now, can you see clearly? Are you sure? Because now we've a tale to tell.
Loma'ai by Jessie Bishop Powell. When people asked about Jana's dark skin and hair and her gray-violet eyes, her mother Manda said, "She was my surprise baby." Those traits, especially the eyes, belonged to the Auric tribe, whose standing with the ruling council was never stable. So the askers usually pretended to think Jana was descended from her stepfather, even though she looked nothing like him, or her younger siblings on that side. Her father, when Jana saw him once a year, was more honest. "Accident," he said. "The caravan leader had a fetching daughter, and I had a terminal problem keeping up my drawers." Jana grew up among her mother's folk, nomadic traders who settled into their mountain valley only in hard winter. Manda polished and mounted gems in cunning settings. She twisted necklaces, bracelets, and rings into life. Jana took the name Cooper from her stepfather. He soaked wood and banded it into casks. Winters his shop came alive with the sounds of hammering, and summers he set up his traveling forge to keep working. Jana herself was apprenticed to the bowwright, and she had nimble fingers and patient hands. She chose feathers and wood all summer long as they traveled. She sat with Derek in his wagon in summer, and in his shop in the cold months, and he guided her hands as she smoothed the wood to a shine and notched it for stringing. "Every tree has a curve, no matter how slight," Derek said. "Pay attention to that as you work. Make the bow conform to that natural shape." She used the feathers to fletch arrows, where she also mounted the sharp little tips she whittled down from flint or obsidian. Increasingly, Jana's next oldest sister minded their brothers, so their parents could sell the family's goods. Jana often went with Derek now. They were watched closely, the sandy-haired bachelor and his young apprentice. And they were careful, never alone long because tongues wagged in their tribe. It wasn't something they spoke of, but in the summer, if Derek went into the wagon for something, Jana made a point to sit up front. Or if she needed something in back, he took the reins or tended to the horses in some other way, so that everyone could see they were not alone in the dark. Winters they sat in his shop, perched on stools, the door open to outside even though it was cold. Jana slighted her friends to hone the craft she loved. It wasn't just making the bows and arrows, but testing them. Derek taught her how to hunt and shoot true, so she could know her own work's quality. Then, too, she earned a little money, because Derek put her pieces alongside his in every town, only telling which had been made by the prentice when pressed. She kept this cash secreted with her stepfather's barrels. Her peers might overlook her darker skin and hair and her purple-tinted eyes, but none of them had the skill to earn money from their apprenticeships yet. They would say Derek favored her, perhaps even that he was courting her, if they knew he gave her money of her own. She was just now 15, the age her mother had been at her own birth, young by her people's standards. Still, one of her friends was already betrothed. Sorry meant to marry outside the tribe. Her vocation ran more towards growing things, skills that made her ill-suited for a nomadic life. She was engaged to a farmer near Derrydown, and if they still liked each other when they met again next summer, her parents would let the wedding go forward. Jonna did not want a husband yet. She was friendly with a number of boys, and she supposed she would go with one of them when the time came. But primarily, she meant to craft bows and hunt. Then came her father's letter, sent with a straggler who had to stop and replace a wheel, and who barely crossed the passes before the mountain snows isolated the village for winter. "My wife died," her father wrote. She had been heavy with their third when the caravan wound through Oryxted the previous fall, and Jonna could guess how she passed. The letter went on, "I have a wet nurse for the babe, and I can manage for the winter, but come spring I must build up my hut again and add a room to take a new wife in the fall. I would pay a good wage if you came and watched your sisters until late summer." Jonna's mother laughed when she saw the note. "He always was so direct," she said. "He doesn't make it sound very appealing," Jonna said. "He doesn't, at that," Manda agreed. "He says he doesn't want the appearance of an affair," Jonna told Manda, quoting the letter. "It's one thing to have loose drawers when you're a young man, but a widower best be clear he isn't buttering both sides of his bread." Jonna's mother laughed again. "So direct," she repeated. "But think about it," she went on. "There are grandmothers he can hire among the Orc if that's his reason. It's a side way in for you he's offering, if you want to take it." "And if I don't?" Jonna's mother shrugged, smiled. "Then you don't," she said. Later, sitting with Derek, both of them sanding bows, Jonna said, "My father wants me to sit with my sisters for 2 seasons." "Oh?" Jonna no more discussed her parentage with Derek than she did the reasons they must always leave the door open when a third party wasn't in the shop. "His wife died," she went on. "Mother says he's giving me a chance to be an Auric. And do you want that?" Derek set aside his bow and watched her. Since he had set his work down, Jonna did the same, but that left her nothing to do with her suddenly anxious hands. "No," she said, gripping the edges of the stool, "but I do want—" It was hard to put into words what she wanted. "You want them to acknowledge you," said Derek. "You want them to stop looking around you and pretending you are purely the Cooper's daughter from the Aram tribe." "Yes, that's exactly what I want." Derek picked up his work once more, allowing Jonna to lift hers again as well. He sanded a while, smooth long strokes that Jonna tried to imitate on her own bow. After a time, Derek said, "You would rejoin us when the caravan came through in fall?" "Of course. I hadn't thought of actually going," Jonna told him. "I don't like to lose 2 seasons learning." Derek smiled. "You wouldn't lose a thing if you kept working, and you would have time to gather a fair amount of wood in 2 seasons. He didn't have to tell her that some of the most expensive bows he sold were teak, or that the time the Aram spent in the southern woodlands was too short for his liking. But the caravan had to hurry by then, to get back to the northern mountains before the heavy snows and ice came. Jonna thought of the Auric forest, where Derek had traded some 16 of his best bows last year, for enough wood to make just 5 more. He expected to sell those for more than every other bow now in the shop, and Jonna was to craft one of them. "You think they would let me take their wood?" "I think if we finished 3 of those," he pointed to the unstarted wood standing in a corner of the shop, "and you take them with you, they will buy them for a cost and open their forest to us both. They will see the value to themselves in what we sell." Jonna put down her work again, this time to cross to the corner where the teak waited. She ran her fingers lightly over her piece. "That would be something," she said. It wasn't just that Auric teak was a strong hardwood. It was infused with Auric magic simply from growing where they lived, and sanded and fitted right those bows shot truer than any in the world. "That would be something," Jonna repeated. "Your father would teach you a little of their skill," Derek went on. "Think about the weapons you could make. There hasn't been a hunter mage since before my father's time." Jonna looked up sharply. "But Derek," she said, "I don't fly. The Orc mages all fly." "Yes, you do," he countered. "Or you did, anyway. When you were a babe in arms, your mother and grandmother tied a little string to your ankle and towed you behind them like a kite." "How would I fly, Derek? I don't have any wings." Well, I don't know where they went, but you used to. I wasn't quite an apprentice myself, but I remember the arrows my father fletched with your feathers were said to never miss their mark. Jonna stared at Derek, her mouth slightly open, her hands dangling at her sides. Then she reached behind herself and patted across her shoulder blades as if she expected wings to have sprouted out of her shirt while they were talking. Forgetting her coat on its nail by the hearth, she turned and walked out of the shop. In the street she ran all the way home and burst in as Manda said a piercing green emerald and a delicate lady's ring. Normally Jonna would never have disturbed her mother at work, but now she no more saw the ring than she did the coat left behind in Derek's shop. "Jonna, what happened, child?" Manda exclaimed. "Derek says I used to fly." "Well, yes," her mother said. "Your feathers stopped growing in when you started walking. But your father told me they would come back if you ever wanted them." "Well, why didn't you ever tell me?" "You never seemed very interested in your father's people." "I guess I wasn't, until now," said Jonna. She sat down on the hearth and watched Manda. Manda went back to the gem. "You've met your baby sisters," she said. "They could do with a bit of family right now, and you have a good hand with the littles." "I suppose so." Jonna ran her hand across her shoulders again. Her whole back had started itching when Derek first told her she used to fly. "But I'm not Oric," she burst out. Now Manda laughed. "Of course you are," she said. "You're as Oric as you are Aram, dear." "I mean, I couldn't stay with them. What if I got there and they tried to keep me?" "Their trouble with the ruling council has always been they force people out, not that they keep them in." "And Father says," again the hand across her own shoulders, "that if I want to fly, my feathers will come back?" "Yes. The flight isn't something external, it's stored within your body. Find a way to work it out." Jonna thought her body was working those feathers out all on its own from just that brush of thought. She felt needles of pain all down her spine, and it was all she could do to keep from tearing her shirt off and running bare-chested into the winter air to cool the stinging. It was that pain, far more than her mother's words, that made her believe Derek. She would not lose ground in 2 seasons with the Oric. Instead, she would gather wood and knowledge. She would learn to train her bows with foresight, so a hunter might see an instant before releasing the string if the shot would fly true, or if it should be held back, the arrow unwasted. Now her back felt like live embers had sparked onto it from the fire behind her. She lurched to her feet, and then she did struggle out of her shirt. It was growing too tight, and she thought the wings would shred it. Manda looked up again from the gem, then set it swiftly aside to help her daughter. Jonna collapsed against her mother, who swayed, but held her upright as blood spilled down the girl's sides, and her back and shoulders erupted into a riot of brightly colored feathers. After a few minutes, Manda said, "Are you all right?" Jonna made a little sound, then said, "Tender." "I should say." Manda lowered Jonna to her knees. "I'm going to get a robe for you to put on backwards, then I'll take you down to the springs. We can stop at the apothecary for numbing powder." Jonna sank down to rest on her arms, which quaked. She felt top-heavy and off-kilter. She thought then that she would go to the Oric, to care for her sisters and to learn what to do with herself. She would not stay more than the 2 seasons, and even that would be hard for someone so used to travel. She formed in her mind the fixed image of that teak sitting in Derek's shop. She felt as though she held it already, smoothing, polishing, and notching the wood. This she would take, along with Derek's 2 finished bows to sell to her father's tribe. But the next bow she made she meant to keep for herself, to learn to hunt in a whole new way. She barely minded that she would miss Sari's wedding. She had larger things to do in her 15th summer, and in spite of her weakness and her pain, she found herself smiling when Manda came back into the room. Sage shifted on her rug and ruffled her shoulder feathers. "Pass me that bowl," she instructed, her blind eyes focused somewhere over Jonna's shoulder. "Which?" Jonna asked. There were 3 bowls in front of her. Her grandmother said, "The one you are thinking of." "Oh." Jonna picked up the right-hand bowl and passed it across the low fire. The old woman nodded and turned it over in her hands, tapping her fingers rapidly around the rim. "This is a good one," Sade said. "Now tell it to me." "Excuse me?" Now Jonna shifted, but where her grandmother had changed positions to get more comfortable, Jonna moved because there wasn't any comfortable to be had in this hut. Her shoulders itched, her feathers tingled, and her rump was sore. She had been sitting with her father's mother for only 15 minutes. Yet in that time she had earned 3 rebukes for her failure to observe tiny and inexplicable things. Behind the hut, Jonna heard her father and several other men hammering on the frame for the new room. She turned her head to look out the open front door and check on her sisters playing just outside. Ba'ita, she of 3 summers and 1,000 temper tantrums, was leading poor little La'ita on a chase. Ba'ita flew just out of La'ita's reach, never beyond the circle Jonna had chalked into the dirt, but always just at its perimeter. La'ita, who had only 1 summer, flapped along after her sister, calling, "Beta, Beta," and laughing. The new baby was not outside. This youngest sister was with the wet nurse, who would bring her home at sunset. Sade said, "Tell me the bull." Jonna clammed her mouth shut, not willing to say she still didn't understand, and risk another encounter with the sharp side of her grandmother's tongue. Ba'ita burst suddenly through the open door. She flew straight into the flimsy back wall, knocking it down into the construction mess with the force of her impact. "Not again, Ba'ita," Jonna said, rising to see if the child was hurt. Although this was the first time Ba'ita had knocked down an entire wall, she had already cracked her wooden bowl in half at breakfast and torn one of Sade's spellbooks in impish play. Nap time, Jonna thought, couldn't come soon enough. The small offender hovered a little off the ground, gazing down at the fallen wall with wide eyes. Blood ran in a steady stream down one arm. "Solly," she whimpered, only it sounded like Solly because she hadn't learned how to make her R's yet. "Why didn't you stop her?" Sade demanded. "Well, I didn't know she was going to—" "Oh. This is something else I should have seen first," said Jonna. Sade sighed and got up herself, their lesson at an end. Jonna heard her father's voice. "Well, here's a mess," Ive said, coming into view. Indicating Ba'ita's bloodied arm with a pointed finger, he asked, "What got her?" Sade knew without the benefit of vision. She hit it at the roof line and scraped a nail. "Come down, Ba'ita, come here," Jonna said. Now Ba'ita saw her shoulder, and the whimper turned into a wail. "Come on," said Jonna. "Come to me." But instead of coming closer, her sister flew up a little higher, her bright blue feathers beating rapidly in alarm. She wanted to come down, Jonna saw, but couldn't slow her wings. "You have some of it," Sade mused to Jonna, "but not the rest. You know why she doesn't come down, but couldn't tell she was heading for the wall in time to stop her." Jonna bit back a sharp reply, and Sade clucked. It didn't matter whether or not Jonna said the words, her grandmother heard the thoughts. She didn't chide this visiting granddaughter further, though. Whether Jonna did or did not carry her people's magic, she could certainly tend well to her sisters, and that brought her a little space from Sade's edges. Sade had doubtless known Ba'ita was headed inside, though Jonna wagered the old woman didn't expect this level of damage. The lessons weren't vindictive. If Sade had realized the wall would pop out and little Ba'ita be truly hurt, she would have warned her oldest grandchild to be ready for the younger one. Jonna flew up to catch Ba'ita, rueing the kick hop she needed to get off the ground. Her father's people could lift off from sitting. Jonna might share their physical features, but she was not one of them. Still, once airborne, she caught Ba'ita easily, sliding her arms in under the girl's wings and pulling the child close. She stroked Ba'ita's back, smoothing her feathers until the little wings stilled, and the girl slumped into a limp puddle on Jonna's chest. Jonna held her much in the way she held the baby, who liked to snuggle tummy to tummy. "It hurts," Ba'ita sobbed as they landed. Sade stalked around the wall's perimeter with Aif, studying it for all the world as if she hadn't lost her sight. "Tell me the wound," she instructed Jonna. It didn't take the foresight to answer this. "It needs sewing," she said. Ba'ita howled, "No!" "How many stitches?" Sade demanded. Jonna started to say, "I don't know," but she stopped after the word I. "4," she said instead. "It needs 4 stitches." Sade grunted. "Good girl," she said quietly. "Can you do it, or do we need the healer?" "If I didn't need to hold her, I could do it," Jonna answered. "But if I don't hold her, she's liable to fight." Sade nodded. "Go then. I'll see to La'ita." And she left off pacing about the fallen wall to walk around front to check on Ba'ita's younger sister. Over dinner, the main room still open to the newly built frame behind, Sade said, I'm beginning to understand how Jonna sees things. And? Aif asked. Said answered, She sees with her eyes, not with her soul. Aif and Said sat at the head and foot of the table with Jonna plopped in the middle, one little sister on either side of her. Baita was still subdued, her sewn-up shoulder bound in a cloth that she complained hurt. She didn't want to eat much, so Jonna was chiefly concerned with tearing Laita's food into small enough portions that the little girl wouldn't choke. The wet nurse had returned the littlest sister. Baby, Aif explained to Jonna, was too young to have a name. Among his people, a child had to live a full year before its naming day, unless it happened to be particularly swarthy. There was no sense wasting a name on a baby if it didn't live to see the use of it. And baby was not swarthy. Couldn't even properly be called healthy. She was still so young that her wings wouldn't lift her, and she lay quiet most of the time. Jonna had never known an infant so listless. She suspected that the wet nurse shorted baby for her own child. Therefore she made a watery mash to put in baby's mouth in the morning before giving her to the nurse, once more as soon as the nurse brought her home, again before they all went to bed, and one more time in the dark hours when the infant woke hungry, rooting for milk Jonna didn't have. Jonna contemplated baby now rather than listen to her father and grandmother's discussion. Baby lay on her back on a quilt, her downy little wings flopped wide open to either side of her body. Jonna tried to decide if the infant looked any stronger since her own arrival. She thought not, and this worried her. If anything, baby seemed more frail, less likely to live long enough to be named. It made her glad her own mother was an Aram trader, not an Auric magician. Her people named babies at birth, a layer of protection against the world's ills, and Jonna had been named even sooner. Since Manda was only 15 at her daughter's accidental conception, the tribe named Jonna in the womb, calling her John, a strong name that could be used for a boy or a girl. Jonna missed her mother and stepfather now. She wished spring would turn quickly to summer, then to fall. She wanted to go back to her Aram family, where her sister was turning 11 and her brothers were 7 and 5. She left for Oryxted when the village began preparing the wagons, and by now the Aram would be well on their way for another year. Instead of the slow pace set by her tribe's sturdy pack animals, Jonna took the stagecoach, which covered in a week distances the Aram spent an entire month traversing. When Jonna arrived, Baita and Laita flew out to meet her, and Jonna was suddenly glad she had spent the entire cold winter learning to fly, so that she did not seem a novice in comparison to children who were still practically babies. She enjoyed these siblings. Laita was too little to really understand what had happened. She wanted for nothing more than cuddling and playing. If Laita got up in the night, it was only to seek out the warmth of Jonna's bed mat, to snuggle and snore. Baita, on the other hand, remembered her mother, and sometimes woke crying inconsolably, so that Jonna had to sit holding her, stroking her silky hair for an hour or more. Baby only cried out once each night for that little meal Jonna left covered on the table, and Baby was so quiet that Jonna slept with a hand stretched out over the child, fearful that she would otherwise fail to hear her need. As her father and grandmother moved on to the topic of the room her father was adding to the hut, Jonna went on watching Baby wave one listless arm. Aif was courting 3 women now, a widow and 2 who had never before married, one of those not much older than Jonna herself. Aif and Said mused how best to decorate the room for the new wife after it was finished, and whether to bother replacing the makeshift wall that had cut Baita, now that the weather was growing warmer. Baby lowered one arm and lifted the other, an exercise in holding up a heavy weight. Then something in her posture shifted, and she was no longer holding up her arm. Rather, the arm was holding the infant down. "Baby," said Jonna, bringing to a halt her grandmother's argument about putting a sleeping hammock in the new room. Jonna half stood, and Baby twisted her head, a violent movement that caused her back to arch. Her face turned blue, and then the instant before Jonna could move, the little girl's body collapsed in on itself, and she vanished. Jonna screamed, "Baby!" and sat down shaking, because Baby was fine. Her little hand still extended to the ceiling, the tiny fist curling and uncurling as she lay on the floor. "Jonna, what happened?" her father asked. "Nothing," said Jonna. I feel foolish." "Jonna," he said sharply, "what did you see? Look at me and tell me what you saw." "I didn't see anything." He took her by the shoulders and said, "Then what did you think you saw?" "I thought she died." Jonna indicated baby with a wave. "She died and disappeared before I could get up out of my chair." Aif growled in the back of his throat. "Then, Jonna," he said, more gently than she had expected, "if you must see with only your eyes, then you must learn to trust them. Now take her quickly to the healer. Come get me if I am needed." Jonna stood, and though her legs would hardly hold her body, she crossed and gathered up baby's warm, reassuring weight, but small, so small. Outside, instead of walking as she preferred to do after dark, Jonna flew to the healer's hut, remembering as she kicked off the ground that he had said, "See you this evening," when she left with Baita earlier in the day. Indeed, he was waiting when she landed once more at his door, but when he saw the tiny bundle in her arms, he let out a dismayed whistle. "I thought it would be Baita again," he remarked, taking baby. Jonna expected confusion then. She thought he would look at the baby and ask her why she had brought it instead. But he cradled baby and held 2 fingers to her tiny throat. He said, "Go for your father." As she turned to leave, Jonna thought she heard a rattle as baby drew breath. After that, she didn't know anything. Aif left for the healer's hut, and Said and Jonna cleaned up from supper in surreal silence. Jonna wrapped Laita and Baita in their sleeping mats, then lit a lantern and sat vigil in the front room. She expected to be alone, but Said soon joined her at the table. "What will happen?" she asked her grandmother. "It depends on what is wrong, and what magic they can conjure." "Then you can't see?" Said said, "No." Forgetting Said could hear her thoughts, Jonna wished she had understood the depth of baby's illness sooner. "No," Said repeated. "Some things simply cannot be seen." "Oh," said Jonna. "But I can tell you this," Said went on. "If baby survives, it will be because you saw with your eyes what the rest of us could not see with our souls." It was a compliment, but little comfort. Jonna didn't answer and leaned heavily on the table. Stacked in front of her, waiting for breakfast in the morning, were the 3 bowls her grandmother had been teaching her to scry with earlier in the day. Jonna picked up the top one and handed it to Said, who did not need to be told to reach out. Jonna said, "The bowl is 2 shades of red, swirled together and spiraling out from the bottom. The darker red is deep as heart's blood, like it leaned in too close to a volcano and came away scarred by lava. The lighter color is more like clay, or bird's feathers, rising up from the earth's center and lifting the heart's blood away from the burning heat." "Good girl," said Said. Jonna went on, speaking quickly before she lost the thing she had seen at the very bottom of the bowl, balanced between the vermilion and the flame. She said, "And my sister's name is Earthbound Bird. I do not know the words in your language, but that is how it goes in the common tongue, and she must have it if she is to live." Jonna was breathing heavily when she finished, shaking as badly as she had been when the vision of baby's death overcame her at supper. Said turned the bowl over in her hands. "Loma'ai," she said. "Earthbound bird. Not small?" Jonna knew enough of the Orc tongue to know that Ita at the end of a word meant small. Baita translated to small firebird, and Laita came out small sky. They would likely drop the diminutives as they grew, as most of the tribe's children did. Jonna shook her head. "Not small," she said. "Not Loma'aita. Loma'ai. If she grows, she will be I, as my father is Aif. Bird." Said nodded and turned the bowl over twice more before setting it on the table. "It had best be me to tell them, then," she eventually concluded. "The namer will spend less time arguing about the waste if she does not have to also complain because it was first seen by an outsider." Jonna agreed. She watched her grandmother walk to the hut's door and lift into the sky, knowing Said's magic would guide the old woman as if her eyes had not completely dimmed. Jonna watched the door for a long time after Said left. Then, because nothing else seemed to help at all, Jonna picked up the bowl and stared hard into its center, trying to find things that simply could not be seen.
And so ends Loma'ai. Of this story, Jessie says, Loma'ai is a response to epic fantasies where a protagonist saves the world. Most of us aren't going to have that chance, but that doesn't detract from the importance of the things we can save. So this is a story about the significance of those small acts of bravery that, though they may not protect the planet, are yet of incalculable importance. What are your thoughts on the story? Do come tell us in the forums at castofwonders.org/forums. Now folks, Cast of Wonders needs your help. We love bringing you free stuff as much as you love getting it, but it does cost us money to produce this podcast. If you can support us, visit castofwonders.org where you'll see 2 donate buttons, one for regular donations and one for once-off donations. Use either one at your discretion. If you can't donate, that's fine. Help spread the word. Blog or tweet about us or like our Facebook page. Cast of Wonders is a production of Wolfsbank Publishing. The editor is Marguerite Kenner. The audio producer and host is Graham Dunlop. Artwork is by Barry J. Northern. It's released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Share it, but don't change or sell it. Theme is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov from musicalley.com.